Joseph Palmer. Yankee farmer, man from Massachusetts, wearer of a big bushy beard, hero. These things are interconnected, believe me. Palmer lived in No Town, which I swear is a real place. It's an unincorporated area, hence the name, between Fitchburg and Leominster, Massachusetts. He was a farmer who, at some point around age 40, decided he would grow a big, bushy, well-maintained beard. And he did, and he wore it to the end of his life. That doesn't sound so controversial now in this, the year of our Lord 2023. It made him the subject of constant vicious public harassment in the late 1820s. Beards were simply not worn at that time in history in New England. Beards had been out of fashion for decades and decades, and they wouldn't come back into fashion for decades more. No one is quite sure what moved Palmer to grow a beard, given all of the beard suppression that he was surrounded by. There were a couple, like 2 specific named people who were known to have beards in Massachusetts in his lifetime, who I can think of, and it's sometimes suggested that Palmer, who never met a progressive religious movement that he didn't like, was a fan of Lorenzo Dow, who was a fiery, charismatic traveling preacher, and who famously had very long hair and a big long beard. Dow wore a long beard just because he was constantly on the road and didn't have time to shave. Palmer was a prosperous farmer who didn't travel much except to go into town and sell stuff off of the farm. He had access to shaving materials, he just didn't want to use them, apparently. The only other notably bearded figure in his lifetime who I can readily think of is Silas Lamson. Lamson was a scythe maker from central Massachusetts who was locally known as Old Father Time because he had a big straggly white beard, he was incredibly skinny, and he made scythes. And, sidebar, Lamson's sons founded a knife-making company in Shelburne Falls, which is still there. But Lamson himself was something of a local character, possibly may have had an untreatable in his time mental illness and spent time living on the street in Boston and was otherwise visibly not doing well. So he was a kind of publicly bearded and publicly uncared for figure. And this kind of reflects the rhetoric around beards in Palmer's day. Not only were they unfashionable, but there was rhetoric that they were unhygienic and gross and bad. And also, somehow, immoral. One of the key harassers of Joseph Palmer was a man named Trask, Reverend George Trask. He was Palmer's minister. Palmer was a Baptist. And Reverend Trask would go out of his way to meet Palmer in public places and tell him off for liking to wear a beard. One of the things that is a little tragic about this is that Trask and Palmer would probably have gotten on really well in some areas of their lives. Joseph Palmer was an abolitionist at a time when being visibly against slavery was not commonly done by white people, and so was Trask. They were also both temperance advocates. Palmer was such a temperance man that when he hired farm workers for temporary work on his farm, he and his wife Nancy would feed them just fine. But they would only give them water to drink, they wouldn't let them drink beer or wine or any kind of distilled liquors. Which itself was a revolutionary move for somebody in that day and age. Trask was a temperance man too. And Trask was an anti-tobacco campaigner at a time when most men, at least, smoked or chewed tobacco. But Trask was not interested in being friends. Trask was interested in telling Palmer how he should maintain his face. On one occasion, Trask said, "Palmer, why don't you shave and not go around looking like the devil?" Palmer said, "Mr. Trask, are you not mistaken in your comparison of personages? I have never seen a picture of the ruler of the sulphurous realms with a beard to speak of. But if I remember correctly, Jesus wore a beard not unlike mine. Now, Palmer was subject to a constant background noise of public harassment. The people around him and his family considered that the Palmers were now acceptable targets for street harassment. Kids would throw rocks at Palmer when he had to go into town. Vandals broke the windows of the family's home. Oh, and just as a side trip into anti-Semitism here, Palmer himself was not Jewish, but he was nicknamed Old Jew Palmer by his neighbors. For the most part, the only intentional beard wearers that a lot of New Englanders would ever have met would have been Jewish guys. It was to the point where neighbor women were using him as a boogeyman to scare their children. You be good or old Palmer will get you. That's the kind of level of acrimony that he was attracting just for having a beard. But he seems to have been a man of strong and tough character who was able to not react to most of this. It sure didn't discourage him or make him change anything about his person or his appearance. But even he lost his temper slightly when he began to experience harassment from Reverend Trask. It got to the point that in early 1830, Palmer tried to go to church. Trask refused him communion. Palmer turned bright red in the face with chagrin. And before anyone could stop him, he walked right by Trask, picked up the communion chalice, and helped himself to communion in front of everyone. Put it down, and he yelled at Trask and the congregation, "I love Jesus as well or better than any of you." And he stormed out. Not long after that, the public harassment stepped up. Palmer had to go into town to do a food delivery from his farm to the Fitchburg Hotel. So he pulls up his wagon in front of the hotel, throws down the reins, gets out, and he's going up the steps. 4 younger men jump him and try to hold him down and shave off his beard forcibly. They brought scissors, they brought razors. They were planning this for some time. Only they do not succeed in shaving off his beard. They get him down, they hurt his back in the process. They threw him down on stone steps while they were doing this. And he starts fighting back furiously, and then he gets out his pocket knife and starts hacking at their legs. He cut 2 guys on their legs, and all 4 of them were frightened by this enough that they ran away. And Palmer picks himself up, dusts himself off, and goes about his business. His 4 assailants did not go about their business. They went straight to the police station, and they laid charges against Palmer for unprovoked assault. 2 days later, Judge David Brigham finds Palmer guilty in court of this unprovoked assault, and fines him for defending himself. Palmer refuses to pay the $10 fine, plus the $40 legal fees, plus the $700 bond for his release. Judge Brigham has him put in jail until he pays that fine. Palmer sits in jail, and there he remains for a very long time. It's a principled stand. As Palmer saw it, and as I see it, if he paid that fine, then it would be equivalent to admitting that the assessment of him as having unprovokedly attacked other men was correct, and he was not having that at all. He had an absolutely miserable time sitting in jail. He got sick. It lasted for months. He was miserable eating the tiny rations that the men being held in Worcester County Jail were served. He wrote many furious letters to the Worcester County Sheriff, describing how bad the conditions were. At one point, he assembled a small package of all of the food he'd been given in one day. It was tiny, and he sent it to the sheriff as a form of protest. He was beaten at least twice by the guards. On one occasion, when he lost his temper and spoke out in fury at the poor treatment of prisoners, he was placed in solitary confinement for 3 months straight. He would not cave, he would not give in, and he wouldn't shave off his beard. Multiple times in there, Other prisoners tried to cut off his beard, so he had to fight them. He also wrote angry letter after angry letter to the papers. His son Thomas would come and visit him in jail, and he would give letters to Thomas, who was sending them to the Worcester Spy, the local paper, also to the Boston Globe. And people read these letters, and Palmer did attract a good degree of public sympathy and interest. Palmer was talked about all over New England, and the judge and the sheriff were uneasily starting to realize that they looked a lot like villains here, and that Palmer was looking increasingly heroic in the public eye. They didn't want to make him a martyr any longer. They sent committees to the jail. The committees begged Palmer, just pay the fine. We'll waive the $700 bond. We'll waive the legal fees. Just pay the fine and you can go home. And Palmer said no. Palmer's exact words were, "If I ain't a safe person to have my liberty, I ought not to go out, and I am willing to stay in confinement till I am." Eventually, Judge David Brigham himself visited Palmer in prison and pleaded with him to please just pay that fine. Here's a letter from your old mother. I think this was a bit of a low blow. Judge Brigham had obtained and hand-delivered a letter from Palmer's old mother. She was over 80, and the letter implored him to pay the fine and come home while she was still alive to see him. Maybe that was what pushed Palmer over the edge. After 15 months in jail, he paid the $10. He was released, he went home, he added prison reform to his list of social causes and went about his life as a farmer and an avid abolitionist. I wish that I could say that his time in prison and his very visible public sufferings for his own autonomy had made him a public hero, or at least that his neighbors and the people around him in public places had learned that you ought to just leave people alone and let them do their own thing. In fact, nobody seems to have quite learned that from this case. He still did attract a measure of street harassment when he went out, and just, neutral public interest. But he also had a great deal of admiration and sympathy from people at all levels of society, including eminent writers and abolitionists and people who were apt to look at him and say, men of courage and grit like that are people we want on our side. So he was able to do more active abolition work than he had been, and he was appreciated by people with the capacity to appreciate his good qualities, put it that way. And I should also note that when he went to Boston to meetings on the anti-slavery cause, multiple times the police had to be called out to disperse crowds from in front of the buildings where the meetings were being held, because young and old from all walks of life had congregated around the front of the building because they wanted to see the man who wore a big bushy beard. You'll remember that one of the things about Palmer is that he never met a progressive religious or spiritual movement that he didn't like. Unrelated, and yet in its own way. The logical next step. In 1843, Palmer rented a bunch of farming equipment at a cheap rate to a commune that was setting up near his own farm. They didn't use the term commune, but that's how we would understand it today. A bunch of intellectuals and social progressives wanted to form a community where they would support themselves by farming, becoming completely autonomous, with no reliance on either the slavery-driven economy that produced cotton fabric and sugar, or on the exploitation of animals, so they'd be vegetarians. They were going to call it Fruitlands. And the co-founder was Louisa May Alcott's dad. I may tell you more about Fruitlands some other time. For now, suffice it to say it was a commune being founded by a whole group of nerds who had never done farming in their lives, and Joseph Palmer, and it lasted 7 months. Joseph Palmer was the only reason that it lasted that long and that they weren't in a condition of starvation the entire time. He came over with a team of oxen, which he just loaned them to help plow when he realized that they were out there in the fields trying to plow themselves by pulling the plow. And he loaned them his milk cow, which they felt conflicted about drinking the milk from because they were supposed to be completely unreliant on any animal product. But a lot of them were off having a clandestine glass of milk anyway. Young Louisa May Alcott was on this commune, and later in life she would recall how Palmer was the only grown-up with any common sense apart from her mother. Matters kind of came to a head at harvest time when Palmer and Louisa May Alcott's mom, by themselves, had to get the entire harvest in because every other adult was either away on a lecture tour or otherwise unavailable. That winter, Fruitlands broke up with maximum acrimony. Palmer took the stuff that he had rented back, and the Alcotts went back to the Boston area and started looking for white-collar jobs again. Joseph Palmer himself bought the farmland that they had been using after it was over, and something about this man and his wife and their grown kids was that they were very hospitable people in general, so they became known for being very good hosts to a whole range of people. They had friends at all levels of society and from all walks of life, so penniless wanderers and people who just needed a bed for the night who they didn't know well came to visit. Famous writers came to visit. Famous temperance workers and abolition movement people came to stay with them. The neighbors, of course, being the judgmental jerks that we have known his neighbors in general to be, called it Palmer's Home for Tramps. But Joseph Palmer and his wife, whose name was Nancy, who seems to have been equally dedicated to being a good person and trying to do their best in life, just kept open house for friends to the ends of their lives, and they did it on the same ground and in the same house that Fruitlands attempted to be a commune in. So the property did get some use for a continual supportive party in its way. By the time Palmer was an old man, beards had come back into fashion big time. Picture anybody you like from the Civil War, chances are he's got a beard. Palmer was seeing a world in which men were walking around with beards equally bushy to his, and nobody thought anything of it. One day he was out walking down the street in Fitchburg, and he met Reverend Trask. Remember Reverend Trask? The guy who refused him communion for having a beard? Now Trask had a beard. Palmer walked very close to him, looked him in the face, stroked his own beard, and murmured, "Knowest thou that thy Redeemer liveth?" It also remains to be said that Thomas Palmer, Joseph's son, when he was a little boy, was embarrassed by how his father was a target of public ridicule, and as he grew up, he realized that he admired his father's courage and personal determination in the face of adversity. Thomas himself stayed living in the area all his life. He was a dentist. He himself grew a big beard and wore that to the end of his life. When his parents passed away, Thomas had their memorial made, and you can see it yourself if you go to Evergreen Cemetery in Leominster, Mass. It's a marble obelisk with the Palmer's names and epitaphs. Palmer's face is depicted on one side of the obelisk, with luxuriant facial hair cascading out of the frame. And underneath the portrait of Palmer it says, "Persecuted for wearing the beard." Though he marched from the town, and I see him no more, still I think of him still, and the whiskers that he wore.